Now I'd like to introduce Leslea Hlusko. She's an associate professor in the Department of Integrative Biology. Is that correct? Could you name it any more complex? Let's see, at UC Berkeley, her research investigates how genes influence skeletal variation and how that has evolved through time, with special interest in understanding our own evolution. In addition to a lab-based genetics research program, she's directed paleontology projects in Kenya and Tanzania, including a recent project at the famous Olduvai, is that correct? Olduvai Gorge. If it's famous, I've never heard of it. At Berkeley, she teaches an award-winning undergraduate course on human biological variation. She's with us tonight to speak on why scientific understanding and an evolutionary perspective on human biological variation might go a long way towards ameliorating some of society's social issues with race. Please join me in welcoming Leslea Hlusko.
Hey, thank you. Hey, thank you all so much. Does this sound okay? All right, excellent. It's an honor to be here. You know, as I was thinking, after I got the invitation from Lynn, I started thinking about how I actually live in an atheist, agnostic community in my department, because I take it for granted that everybody kind of thinks of religion as a belief system, and that's not, you know, so it's really great that there is this community that you all have formed, and, you know, my hat's off to you. This is great. You're doing great stuff, and I'm honored to get a chance to meet you and to share my work with you. Before I get started, though, your last presentation was on the problem with scientists. Any heads up I might want to know before I say anything else? You're in the clear. I'm in the clear? That's like a trick. Yeah, so I'm really interested in human evolution, and my science is much more specific about how genes influence dental variation, how that's evolved through time. I do a lot of paleontology. I do a lot of statistical genetics. Those are things that don't actually really resonate with your typical person walking down the street. But what does really resonate with people is how all of that research on a grander scale affects their everyday life. And those of us who study human biology and human evolutionary biology, we actually do have a view of the world that I think is very useful for people to understand, especially the scientific facts, the scientific evidence behind the theory of evolution and how humans evolved and the fact of human evolution. So my teaching is very much focused on trying to get that message and to get that information to people who are not necessarily interested in biology or don't think they want to know anything about it. I teach a large lecture class to non-majors, trying to get students out of the humanities and social sciences who may never take another biology class ever again in their life, to give them the kind of the basic biological skills they need to live in the world today, and also to maybe change their mind that the biology is something that gives you a different perspective on ourselves and how we interrelate with each other. So I'm going to talk about not my own research here, but more a topic that I know resonates with people a lot. So in my class on human variation, there are 3 lectures that I give that students seem to really, really like. One of them is on sex. The other one is on sexual orientation, and the last one is on skin color. So I thought I'd talk about skin color today with all of you. Invite me back. Yeah, it's all downhill from here. Sorry. So when we're thinking about skin color and human variation, we'll talk about it on 2 different levels. One level is kind of down here, which is the biology, sort of what's happening that causes variation in skin color. What are the genetic mechanisms and things like that. But then there's also a larger perspective that we need to keep in mind, sort of the 10,000-foot perspective. And that's that we are the product of evolution, that, you know, we are here because of evolution. So everything that we do, sitting in this room, driving here, waking up this morning with our alarm clocks, talking on our cell phones, all of this is only possible because our biology enables us to do it. And that biology is the result of millions and millions and millions and millions of years of evolution. And so when we think about human variation, we need to think about not just the sources of what underlie the variation that we're talking about, but also why we pay attention to that. Why does it matter? Why are we sensitive to particular kinds of variation? And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is, we're primates, right? And primates are highly social animals. We have been for a very long time. We're not the only animals that are primates, and not all primates are social, but we are extremely, extremely social, including some of our closest relatives, gorillas that you see here. One of the other things is that as primates, we're also incredibly visual animals. It goes all the way back to about 65 million years ago. We started eating fruits, and being able to see color better served our ancestors very well to be able to see that. So we became very sensitive to different colors. And so we're highly social, and we're highly visual animals. So keep that in mind. So then it's not surprising then that when we look at all of the variation in the people that we run into on a day-to-day basis, first off, that we're like, whoa, you look different than me. One, because we're really attuned to that, but we're actually really only attuned to the things you can see. Like I have no idea what your blood type is, but I can look at you and kind of see what color you are. How much pigment do you have in your skin, right? So we're sensitive to just the things that we see in terms of how we determine our social groups. And millions of years of evolution, we're very, very sensitive to who is in our social group and who is not in our social group. Because for the vast majority of our time as a species, and as species before that, we lived essentially in small tribes, and it was a matter of life and death to be able to know who was in your group and who wasn't in your group, and to navigate those relationships. So from this evolutionary perspective, of course we pay attention to these things. Of course we care. Of course you have a knee-jerk reaction when you look at somebody. You see what they look like. Oh, you look like me. Oh, you look like my family. Oh, you do not look like my family and the people that I grew up with as a small child. So that's totally okay. That's millions of years of evolution. What's not okay, or what is okay, is how you deal with that, how you handle that reaction. So racism is really not handling that reaction well. But having that reaction is just something that we as primates, we just can't not do. And so it's okay to see differences. So I think I would argue it's wrong to not acknowledge that there are differences. And I think it's also wrong not to talk about them, and to talk about the implications, and talk about all the social stuff around it. Because then we can say, this reaction is bad, this reaction is good. We have control over what we do with the fact of our evolution. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, now let's go to that level down here and talk about, okay, so why do people have different skin color? How does that actually come about? And then, after we do that, we're going to talk about two other things. We're going to talk about ultraviolet radiation, the good and the bad. Well, actually, we'll start with the bad, and then we'll do the good. So we have 3 sections for what we'll cover tonight. So many of you may be familiar with Jared Diamond and his awesome writings. He's really a nice read on many fronts, and I know a lot of people have read this book, The Third Chimpanzee. It's a nice read. I want you to keep in mind that it was written in 1993, and the study of human variation is a science, and so things change and we learn new things. And 1993 was a long time ago. If you think about all the advances in genetics, for example, a lot has changed. He was very skeptical that skin color variation had anything to do with ultraviolet radiation. And he had a lot of kind of good reasons at the time for that. He has since changed his mind, and he's written a couple pieces that were published in the journal Nature, for example, that are actually much more in line with what I'm going to be telling you tonight. And what I'm going to be talking about is based primarily on work that was beautifully put together by Nina Jablonski and her colleague George Chaplin. She wrote this book, Skin, A Natural History, back in 2006, and then more recently, a couple years ago, published Living Color. So these are both really nice books, and so if you're interested in learning more about what I'll be talking about, I point you to those resources, especially Living Color, since it's the more recent version. So you're getting my spin on Nina and George's work, along with some additional information of things that have come out since, especially on the genetics front. So what actually causes skin to have color anyway, right? So Melanin is the primary pigment that gives skin its color. Here you're looking at a blown up section through skin, and here's the melanin in these cells right here at the bottom of what's called the epidermis. So other things that give skin its color is keratin, but keratin is not actually in people. Keratin is that orange photosynthetic chemical that you see in carrots and tomatoes. That is not why some of us who are very pale like me get really red. I don't have keratin. I get red because of hemoglobin. And so hemoglobin is the iron transporting proteins in red blood cells. And so that's when people have exercised, that's why they end up kind of turning red, is because of the blood that's coming to the surface of their skin. And so people who are very fair-skinned, like me, we do turn red, but not like a carrot. So melanin, now, melanin is found, as you saw in that last slide, in those cells that are right at the bottom of the epidermis here. So you have the epidermis as that outer skin layer, and the dermis the inside. The epidermis is really only 1 millimeter thick. So this difference is really only 1 millimeter, not even skin deep, but 1 millimeter deep. And it's just this one sort of basal line of cells there. And within the cells that are in that bottom part of the epidermis, about 1 out of 100 is this thing called a melanocyte. And melanocytes are the ones that make these little melanosomes that are the actual containers of pigment. And they have about 36 keratocytes that sit around them. And so then these little bits of melanin kind of go out onto the edges of these keratinous cells, and then they sit there and serve as caps, basically, on these cells. So you have these little dendritic things, these dendritic cells that are intermixed in all of this. So you have variation then in the density of the melanin that's in these cells, and also in the density of the melanin, things like that. But what you don't actually have between different populations is a different number of melanocytes. So that's not the reason why some people have lighter skin and darker skin. It's these other variables about the melanin that underlies that variation. You do have variation in your own body. So on the palms of your hands, on the palms of your feet, you only have about 10 to 20% the number of melanocytes that you have on, say, like your belly. And so that's why you have variation in pigmentation on your own body, but that's not what explains the differences between people who are lighter or darker skinned there. So I want to step now to take a little step away from our own skin and talk about skin of other organisms. There was some really neat work that came out in 2007 out of a lab at Stanford. Was led by a guy named Craig Miller, who's now at Berkeley, a good colleague of mine. And they were doing work looking at these stickleback fish. And sticklebacks are just the coolest model to be able to study evolution and the genetics that underlie a lot of the variation in these evolutionary processes. And so in looking at these sticklebacks, you know, some of them are lighter skinned and some of them are darker skinned. And what they found is that these sticklebacks that have the darker skin, much more melanin in their skin, is that these lighter skinned ones had mutations in the KIT ligand gene. And it was these mutations in KIT ligand that underlie these lighter skinned fish, their difference. And so the lighter skinned fish are a derived version of that KIT ligand gene. Okay, so what, right? They're fish. So here's the cool part, is that then they looked at human variation, and they found that when you look at Europeans and you look at Asians, that they similarly have mutations in the KIT ligand gene that result in the lighter skin color, and that there is evidence of selection in both of these populations for these lighter skin tones. So selection for a mutated version of KIT ligand underlying the light skins that you see in people living in Europe and the light skin of the people you see living in Asia. So isn't that kind of neat that the same gene that underlies pigmentation variation in fish is the same one in us? Evolution, right? So a perfect demonstration of evolution. The same mechanisms, time and time again, are used or selected for to solve similar problems, to solve similar dilemmas. So back to the skin. One of the things that we know about melanin is that it's this kind of gooey, gloppy, fudgy kind of complicated protein. And one of the things that it's really good at is absorbing ultraviolet radiation. And it does a couple of other things. There's arguments about the benefit of some immune benefit to having more melanin. There's also there's thoughts that you lose less water through your skin, things like that. But really the main thing that melanin seems to do and does very well is it absorbs ultraviolet radiation. And so you'll remember, perhaps from a physics class in high school or whenever, is that there are 3 different types of ultraviolet radiation. There's UVC, which are the shorter wavelengths, and most of these are blocked in the atmosphere, so they don't actually hit the surface of the Earth. But then you have the UVB radiation and the UVA radiation. And UVB is only about somewhere around like 5% of the ultraviolet radiation that we get exposed to is UVB. And it doesn't penetrate quite as deeply as the UVA radiation does. This is the really, really bad one, though. So, if you had to choose, you might choose to have only that, but we don't get to choose. So UVB is primarily responsible for a lot of the very specific mutations that we get in our DNA, because ultraviolet radiation damages DNA, it damages cell membranes, and it breaks down some bioactive compounds in our cells as well. And so UVB is the one that really hurts DNA, it causes mutations in DNA. UVA is bad in the sense that it produces some chemicals and interacts with some of the chemicals in your body that then can lead to damage in DNA, but it doesn't directly mutate the DNA quite the same way, to quite the same level that the UVB would. And this is why we might want to worry quite a bit about the ozone layer, because as we lose the ozone layer, it's the UVB radiation that tremendously increases, which is the worst kind to interact. So our melanin is awesome because it absorbs that ultraviolet radiation and kind of protects us from that. And so all of the organisms that have melanin, that's what its primary function is for. So mushrooms, for example, fish, lizards, all of these animals that have this brown melanin, that's what it's doing for them, is that protection from ultraviolet radiation. And so then really what melanin is just a natural sunscreen. It's that simple. But then why do people have variation, right? Why is there some people with dark skin and some people with light skin and some people in between? What's that all about? Well, as you know, you can look at me and probably make a really good guess as to where my ancestors are from. Want to guess? Oh, you're so good. My name is a dead giveaway, too. But then look at me, right? Yeah, I mean, this is why, like in the 1990s, talking about skin color was such a hot topic, because we were supposed to pretend like everybody looked exactly the same. We're all exactly the same, right? But it's really fascinating now to talk to students at the college level, and these 20-year-olds are like, well, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Of course we're not all the same. We look different from each other. Why? And they want to know why. So it's interesting how from the time when I was in college to now has changed so much, and that's largely because, duh. People with darker skin, you find them around equatorial regions, and you see people with lighter skin, generally speaking, as you move away from the equator, so as you get into those higher latitudes. So skin color's got something to do with latitude. Well, not exactly, right? Because, your skin doesn't know exactly where you are on the planet, but what it does know, it is a response, though, to different levels of ultraviolet radiation. Because ultraviolet radiation is much higher in equatorial regions and also at higher elevations than it is as you move farther away from the equator and as you get away. So the more atmosphere you have, the more the ultraviolet radiation is filtered through that. Now, if we're thinking about evolution, and we want to make a case, so one of the things to keep in mind too is evolution is a historical science, so we can't run the clock again and tinker with a few things and kind of see what happens. We have to use inference. Right? I mean, Charles Darwin, his whole book on the origin of species is this beautiful example of how you do inferential science, how we do historical science. Is you keep looking at different lines of evidence, and if they keep giving you the same answer, then maybe you're onto something. This is also why, maybe this is the problem with scientists, that we're never certain about anything. Was that the problem? Yeah, so none of us will ever definitively say this is definitely the answer, because it always just depends on, you might find something out tomorrow that changes that. So one of the things we need to see is, is there evidence that different levels of ultraviolet radiation might actually have an effect on your evolutionary survival, on your evolutionary fitness. So evolutionary fitness is not how strong you are, right? Evolutionary fitness is all about sex. Not just sex, actually. Productive sex. It's the number of offspring that you have and how well your offspring do. Do they survive to adulthood, and do they have kids? Because the thing is, I always like to remind everybody, is that every single person in this room, we are all evolutionary winners. We're like the success stories since the dawn of life, right? Actually, I was talking to Lynn about, being a new mother of a 4-year-old at home, is that I had to keep reminding myself, all of the mothers in my lineage have done really well, right? So, I'm okay. I'm going to do okay, I think. Yeah, so can ultraviolet radiation have an effect on your ability, on an individual's ability to successfully reproduce? Well, let's check that out. So I mentioned before that there's all these kind of negative things that happen with ultraviolet radiation getting into your skin, and it breaks down, damages DNA, breaks down cell membranes, and one of the other things that it does is it damages folate. And so folate is pretty important for a number of different things that your body needs to do. Aids in the production of red blood cells, and it helps your body digest different proteins and utilizes utilize different proteins and digestion and all that. But the really big thing that folate does that I want to draw your attention to is that it is essential in the synthesis of DNA. Now, your body is constantly making new cells, right? And so that means that it's constantly making new DNA. DNA is replicating itself. I mean, every 7 years, you're basically an entirely new person, right? So this is a pretty important process, especially if you're a guy, because you make a lot of new DNA when you make sperm. So folate's pretty important for the production of sperm. And folate is particularly important, though, for somebody else. Any ideas who that would be? A fetus, exactly. And so if you think about in your life, the most essential times for your DNA replication to work well, it's in the earliest stages of your development. And about 20 years ago, it was recognized that there were a suite of birth defects that were associated with folate deficiencies. And these were defects that happened really early on in development, about 24 days after fertilization. This is what the little embryo looks like. And then here you start to see where it's still not looking like a person. So this is 24 days after conception. And so what's happening is this area here is going to zip up and basically start to form this spinal area of the body. And so if you have a folate deficiency as a mother, early on in your pregnancy, so early that you probably don't even know you're pregnant yet, your baby is going to possibly have some pretty serious problems with the development of their neural tube here. So these are the neural tube defects, and commonly known as spina bifida, where that neural tube didn't close up quite properly. As you can see, there's different extremes of the folate deficiency early on in these kinds of birth defects. And this is why women today of reproductive age actually in their multivitamins are taking folic acid, which is the man-made version of folate. And this is why women who are pregnant or attempting to get pregnant or thinking about it are told, take folic acid, take folic acid, take folic acid. It actually takes your body a little while to build it up too. So if you know women of that time of life or thinking about it in a few years, advise, go ahead and take it. Why not? So this can have pretty serious effects then on a baby's ability to develop properly and then to be able to survive into adulthood, right? Everybody buy that? If you can't replicate your DNA early on in development, you're not going to make it. Yeah, so now I want to bring you to some really neat work that Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin put together using some data from NASA. So they had about 2 million data points where NASA had measured how much ultraviolet radiation hit the surface of the Earth over about, I think it might have been a 15-year period or so, and put it all together on this map. And so what the colors represent on this map is the intensity of the ultraviolet radiation that's hitting the surface, the land surfaces. They got rid of the water because people don't usually live there, so just to look at the land masses. And what you're seeing then with the intensity of color is that as you get into these areas, this is the much more intense ultraviolet radiation, and that the green, sort of then moving away, the green is the much less intense ultraviolet radiation. And so these are the areas in this central area, right along the equator, where that damage to the folate is the highest potential because there's so much ultraviolet radiation. So when you live in this area, your biggest problem is too much ultraviolet radiation damaging your folate. So this is your issue. This is selection operating on that, selecting for people who have some kind of mechanism in their body that protects their folate. And that mechanism, melanin. So you also see, whoa, that's Africa, right? So where did humans evolve? We've been there the longest. Yeah, so our lineage split with the chimpanzee lineage about 8 million years ago, 7 million years ago. So we've been there a really long time. So then, how long have, what was the ancestral condition? Is it light skin for our species? Is it light skin? Is it dark skin? When did that evolve? Well, there's no fossil record for skin within our lineage. We can get some cool dinosaurs and things like that, but we don't have any such thing for our lineage. So again, we're going to use some inference here. So one of the things you can do is to look at our closest relatives, the chimps and the bonobos, and see what their skin looks like. So here's some pictures. So here you got the gorillas, dark skin. Here you have chimpanzees, baby chimps, light skin. Ooh, grown-up chimps, not quite so easy anymore, right? And then these are the bonobos. They got pretty dark skin too, but they have light skin of kids. So that doesn't help that much. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, so we're going to need some other lines of evidence. So I wanted to bring your attention to these are chimpanzee chromosomes on the that are white, and the yellow are the humans. Forget the chimps. We're going to only talk about the humans. And specifically, I want to draw your attention to chromosome 16 here, actually on one of the ends of chromosome 16. There's a gene called the melanocortin-1 receptor. And when geneticists were looking at the melanocortin-1 receptor, and they were looking at variation in the melanocortin-1 receptor sequence, is that when you look at people who are living in Africa today, and whose ancestors have been there for quite a while, I'm not talking about British expats or anything, but the people who are ancestrally there, is that there's incredibly little variation in the melanocortin-1 receptor. Any ideas why that might be informative? What would so little variation actually suggest from an evolutionary perspective? Conservation, yeah. That it's been selected, that if there's much variation, that variation isn't doing those people much good, and they tend not to do as well in an evolutionary fitness perspective. But when you look at the melanocortin-1 receptor sequences outside of Africa, there's a huge amount of variation, which suggests then that there has been selection for some of those variants, for some of the mutations that occurred weren't as deleterious in the other environments outside of Africa as they had been inside of Africa. Now, when did that happen? When did you get this phenomena occurring? So you can kind of backdate and consider some of the statistical parameters around this. And the estimate is that in order to get the pattern that we're seeing and to get that amazing level of conservation within Africa, it would have been about a million years ago. And so now the other thing to keep in mind is that having dark skin and all that melanin to protect you, selection for that probably is really going to mostly be intense if you don't have fur. Because if you have fur, that helps. That covers you up, right? And so it's suggesting then that by a million years ago, we were naked and dark skin. And there's all kinds of really neat stuff going on with our sweat glands. We're also extremely sweaty animals. And sweat doesn't work, especially like the really watery sweat that comes out of your eccrine glands. That we have way more of those than any other animal around. So 1 million years ago, bipedal, dark-skinned, incredibly sweaty ape walking around. That was us. So embrace it. Okay, so that gives you the sense of what's going on here and what has been going on there for at least 1 million years. Now I want to draw your attention to the area that has these sort of somewhat dispersed dots in this region and in this region, because now we're going to flip the story. So we looked at how ultraviolet radiation can do bad things, especially to your folate, and why there would be selection to protect your folate. Now I want to switch the story around, because ultraviolet radiation can also do things that are good. Well, particularly one thing, and that is you need some ultraviolet radiation to hit your skin in order to start the whole process of your body synthesizing vitamin D. And so you need ultraviolet radiation at the surface of your skin. And so one of the neat things is that it is this 7-dehydrocholesterol that sits in your epidermis at the same level as your melanocytes. And that is what, when ultraviolet radiation hits it, that starts this whole complicated and really interesting process that ends up having your body making vitamin D, and then your body can absorb calcium out of your diet. So without vitamin D, your body can't absorb calcium. So there's 2 ways to be calcium deficient: not having vitamin D or not having enough calcium. And so if you don't have enough vitamin D, by definition, your body is not absorbing the calcium it needs. So that's 2 different ways to get that. But the ultraviolet radiation then is pretty important in this. Now, when you have one of the things that melanin does is that it competes with this 7-dehydrocholesterol. Dehydrocholesterol, it's like the greatest word. The chemists are amazing. Is that melanin competes with that to capture ultraviolet radiation. So the more melanin you have, the more it's going to be winning out in this competition with this vitamin D precursor in the skin. And so if you're not getting as much ultraviolet radiation anymore, the melanin then is going to be winning that battle, and they're going to have less and less vitamin D being made. So can you see where the issue is coming here? So you need some ultraviolet radiation to make vitamin D, and you need vitamin D to build and maintain strong bones and to maintain a healthy immune system. So now, being with your vitamin D deficient, is that really a problem at the level that it would affect your reproductive fitness? Let me try to make the case for you that it is. So for the people then who are living here, I'm going to try to make the case for you that it's harder for them to make vitamin D, and that has negative consequences. If you have, the harder it is. So there's selection then to make that easier. So when you don't get enough vitamin D, you're going to end up with things like childhood rickets, which was quite common in the 18th and 19th century in Britain. And what happens is that the bones just don't have enough calcium, and so they're soft. Not an issue. You wouldn't notice this in babies that don't walk. They can be vitamin D deficient, and you wouldn't have any idea unless they've been tested at the doctor's office. It isn't until they stand up and they start trying to walk on 2 legs, and that weight of their body starts to deform the weight-bearing bones in the bottom part of their skeleton especially. And this is why rickets is very characterized by those bowed legs. It's also characterized by deformation in the pelvis. Now, deformation in the pelvis might not be too much of a problem for the men in the room, but it would be a very serious problem if you're a woman. And that's because in childbirth for our species, it just barely works. There's not a lot of room for error. Sorry, Lynn. There's not a lot of room for error. And so if you deform your pelvis even a little bit, you're going to have a really big problem actually getting that baby out, because it's a very, very fine-tuned process. Anyway, that's a whole nother. You have to invite me back for that one. Now, I want to point out just how strong of a selective pressure that is. So when you look around the world today, worldwide, maternal hemorrhage is the 4th leading cause of death for women in their reproductive years. So out of 1,000 deaths of women who die in their reproductive years, years, 123 of them died in childbirth. And so in low-income countries, it's the third, just below HIV and tuberculosis. And if you're curious, in more Western countries, the first leading cause of death is like car accidents and suicide. Anyway. The other thing is that you don't have to kill a woman in order to completely null and void her ability to have children and to be evolutionarily successful. There's other ways to accomplish the same thing without them even dying. So for example, obstetric fistulas, and you may have heard about these because they're a very big problem, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where people have in the areas where they have very little access to basic health care. And so what happens is that as a baby is being born, it's being pushed down into that pelvic cavity, pushed against those bones. And that's okay for a little while, but if something starts to delay that process, is that baby's head pressure is pushing all of those tissues very tightly against the bone, and those tissues will start to die after a while. So women who are in labor for quite a long time will start to have that, the dying tissues. And what that leads to then are these holes between basically their uterus and, say, their bladder or their rectum. And so those holes don't fix themselves if you just let them be. So the baby may be born, might be okay, likely probably died in childbirth if it was that laborious. But the woman no longer has control over her bladder or her bowel movements, because they all then go out through the vagina. And these women are completely shunned. They smell, imagine. And they're shunned from their societies. And once you kick them out of social groups, out of their, they're not going to have any more children because they're shunned. And so that's another way that the maternal death rate is not really the only way to look at this. You also have to consider obstetric fistulas as well, and those complications that come with this. And these are tragic because these are actually pretty easy things to fix, and there's a lot of great movement to try to do that and to help these women. It's not necessary. They're pretty simple to fix. So now I want to look at the genes that are involved in that variation, because hopefully I've made the case that there would be selection for differences in skin color, depending on where people are living. So now, what kind of mechanisms could result in that variation? So we talked about, oops, my animation didn't work quite so well. Anyway, we already talked about the KIT ligand gene, and that I told you about the evidence for this selection in the Europeans and the Asians for the lighter skin color variants. So there's also this DCT gene, and it shows evidence of selection in a Chinese population. There's KIT ligand, came a little late. There's also these other genes, MATP, SLC24A5, OCA2, and TYRP1. Yeah, those geneticists have wacky names too. So these show evidence of selection in European population. So you're seeing that it's the light-skinned populations that are the mutations that were selected for outside of so in those more higher latitude regions. So I want to go back to that melanocortin-1 receptor gene too. So remember that one before? We were talking about on chromosome 16, and that, anyway, okay, so you remember that one. Now, a few years back, so you've probably heard people talk, or in the news, all that hype about, hey, Neanderthal DNA, and that they sequence DNA from Neanderthal bones, and that you can learn all kinds of cool things. Well, I'm not sure anyway, that's a whole nother lecture too. But one of the cool things that they did is this team led by a guy named Leslea Hlusko sequenced some regions of DNA from 2 Neanderthal individuals, and those regions contain the melanocortin-1 receptor gene. And in both of these individuals, they had the same mutation in the melanocortin-1 receptor gene. Now, it's a mutation that you do not see in people today, but they were able, because it was in a protein coding region, they were able to see what that mutation, what kind of effect it would have had on the protein that the melanocortin-1 receptor makes. And it makes that protein dysfunctional. So there are people today who have a dysfunctional melanocortin-1 receptor, and the protein is dysfunctional in the same way, and they have red hair, and they're fair-skinned. And so, we know that Neanderthals look different in a lot of different ways from their skeletons, But we also now have evidence that perhaps they were, at least 2 of them, had red hair. And that they did this light skin phenotype not using a mutation that we have. So again, another line of evidence that there was selection in that lineage for light skin in those northern latitudes. And they did it differently than we did. So time and again, you're seeing evidence of selection for light-skinned individuals, and they're using similar genetic mechanisms, but they're doing it with different mutations. We call that convergent evolution. So Europeans, Asians, Neanderthals, and who else? I don't know. Okay, so now we've covered this region, and we've covered this region, but I haven't yet told you about this one up here. So the really neat thing is that when you look at the pattern, it's like, okay, dark skin protects you here. Dark skin is not so much of an advantage here, but actually a disadvantage because you're not getting as much ultraviolet radiation. And so then there's selection for lighter skin. And so selection for lighter skin enabled people to be living in these regions by, I mean, you've got people living in like this region of the world by, almost 2 million years ago. Okay? But then we don't have people living in these much more northern latitudes until much, much more recently. About 36,000 years ago is the earliest archaeological evidence for people living up in this part of the world. And what these dots are telling you, and the gray, the light gray, and the dark gray, is that based on the amount of ultraviolet radiation that hits the surface of the Earth up in those regions, even if you stood outside naked all year round, you would not get enough ultraviolet radiation to make enough vitamin D to be healthy. You'd also be really cold, but that you just can't do it on skin color alone. You can't survive there on skin color alone. So what you need then is culture, right? Okay, so we have it easy. So we just go to the grocery store, right? And so this is why in the 1930s we actually started fortifying milk with vitamin D. Now the vitamin D that we use to fortify our milk is only about 25% as potent as the vitamin D that your skin makes. So it's a good substitute, but it's not a great one. So this is why, it's definitely a trade-off for fair-skinned people to slather SPF all over them, or to cover themselves up, is that there's this trade-off that's happening. Well, the cultural innovations that enabled people to live in those regions were things like fishing, because there's a number of fish that are pretty high in vitamin D. Also hunting, say, reindeer. Reindeer eat a lot of this stuff called lichen, and lichen is very vitamin D rich as well. And there are practices in the cultures that are living in these regions these days, that they will often actually eat the guts of reindeer and caribou that still have lichen in them and prepare dishes and soups and stuff out of that as well. So all kinds of ways to supplement, but these were cultural innovations in terms of the different diets that then enabled people to live there. So to summarize then, is one, the evolutionary advantage of having dark skin is that dark skin acts as a natural sunscreen, and it protects against breakdown of folate by ultraviolet radiation. So this is a problem in geographic regions where ultraviolet radiation exposure is high. So then, what's the evolutionary advantage of light skin? So in geographic regions where the level of ultraviolet radiation is low, skin with less melanin facilitates the production of vitamin D. So it's all good. Kind of just depends where you are, right? Now, one of the other things, though, is that now that we have a sense of how the variation happens and why there's selection for different levels of melanin in the skin, and of course it's going to be a clinal effect because there's, ultraviolet radiation doesn't just like switch on and off at different latitudes, right? It's clinal, and this is why some people, there's like the whole range of variation, and that it changes gradually. One of the reasons we kind of need to get comfortable with that fact and all of this is that we do kind of need to talk about this, because there are significant consequences of what your skin color is and where you're living and how you're kind of operating in a day-to-day sense. So I wanted to highlight a little bit of that just to get you thinking. So on a day-to-day basis, why it would be useful for people to understand just the basic science behind skin color variation. One is, for some people, probably more important than for others, But you remember that melanocortin-1 receptor gene that underlies the red hair phenotype? Well, melanocortin-4 receptor is another gene that we know quite a bit about, and it's implicated in different levels of anxiety. So, some of you may know some redheads, and you may have heard that redheads don't do very well at the dentist's office, and it's because either they have a higher resistance to the anesthesia that's used, that's injected into that. So anesthesiologists actually talk about this as well, that you up the dose of the anesthesia, whatever, painkillers for redheads. But also this is a really big problem in the dentist's office as well. And that there may well be something to this, because if you think about, these are two genes in the same family, and that they have some commonalities. And so the redheads who complain about going to the dentist, there's good reason to believe that they really do feel more pain than those of you who don't. One of the other things to keep in mind is then, of course, the potential danger of sunbeds. Tanning booths and going to this. And this is something that has been catching on for quite a while. There was, for at least 20 years, so about 20 years ago, there was a study that came out where an obstetrician noticed that he had this cluster of babies that were born to young women that had neural tube defects. This is getting at that folate deficiency issue. And so he was like, I kind of want to know what's going on. So he surveyed them to find out what they had done, what might be some commonalities that possibly would correlate and possibly be causal with these neural tube defects. And surprisingly, there was a correlation with women who had been in tanning beds early in their pregnancies, i.e. maybe before they even knew they were pregnant. And so that started getting people thinking about just how dangerous it is, not only for embryonic development, but then also knowing just how bad it is. You don't need all that much extra ultraviolet radiation. And so, as you may know, in 2012, there was the California State Senate Bill 746, which took effect. And this made it basically illegal for people under the age of 18 to be in tanning beds. And so there are some legal actions that have been taken to try to circumvent some of these issues as well. Okay, so another one I want to bring to your attention is this recent rise of rickets. Apologize for the very texty slide, but I couldn't figure out a good picture for this. And I also didn't want to get it wrong in terms of how presenting their interpretations and their work. So in the UK, this study found that perhaps 20% of children from all social classes show signs of the disease. And Professor Clark, who ran the study, says, this is almost certainly a combination of the modern lifestyle, which involves a lack of exposure to sunlight, but also covering up in sunshine. And we're seeing cases that are very reminiscent of 17th century England. And I can attest that every time my 4-year-old daughter goes outside at her preschool, they lather her up in the most amazing amount of sunscreen. And on one level, I really appreciate that, and on another level, I definitely struggle with it. And so, this vitamin D deficiency is very real. There are some other reasons why rickets is on the rise as well. So in Saudi Arabia, vitamin D deficiency is widespread, but it's more so in females. And this has been attributed mainly to nutritional and social customs, particularly the avoidance of sunlight and prolonged breastfeeding. And so if you have a mother who is vitamin D deficient, her breast milk is vitamin D deficient, and the baby is vitamin D deficient. And so there are definitely some cascade effects here as well. So we're encouraging breastfeeding, but that has a catch-22 if mom's vitamin D deficient. And so all of these do have some it's evolutionary biology, but it has some very real effects, some very real ramifications for our health and our well-being. And so hopefully I've made the case for you as to why having this scientific and this evolutionary perspective on skin color variation is, one, makes it more scientific, and then people are perhaps less invested on all of these social misconceptions about what it is and what it isn't. And then also that then we can have conversations about how to improve our health in a very just sort of open and frank and non-threatening, hopefully, one day way. So thank you very much. Definitely.
All right.
And,
It's on, working. Check. All right. So I don't know if you consider these freckles, but I think I and most people probably have black spots, not red.
Yeah.
Are those signs of our ancestral blackness coming through? I mean, that's why, I mean, because they're dark pigmented.
Yeah, so
they're
actually,
not red like freckles.
So I actually only recently figured out the answer to what I think is the answer to that, is that in people who have darker skin, is that their melanocytes are more evenly distributed over their epidermis, and that in people who are more fair skinned, they actually are more clustered. And so you get a clustering effect to the pigmentation rather than a more even distribution. And the paper that I read didn't directly link that to freckles and moles, but my guess is that that's a logical interpretation of how you get freckles and moles, because it is clusters of concentrated melanin. So there's questions in the back. Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, so the quick question, which is, I had always heard that the vitamin D that you need can be gotten by about 10 to 15 minutes in the sun, but you seem to imply that at some latitudes that's not true. Is that, what is the recommended daily sun exposure?
Yeah, well, that's a loaded question, and I would refer you to your healthcare professional. Yeah, and that's the problem, is that it really is, it's a catch-22. Is that the longer you're out in the sun, the longer you're going to have ultraviolet exposure, and there's good and bad with that as fair-skinned people. So I'm not going to be able to tell you that. But up here in the San Francisco area, basically, if you're out in January, I wouldn't worry at all about getting sunburned, because we're at, what, 38 degrees latitude, and that's pretty high. But so they have these beautiful graphs that actually show the intensity of the ultraviolet radiation that by latitude, and that you can really see how variable that is depending on the season. And so at 38 degrees, we're really affected by the seasons, and so. When does it get better? It gets bad like July and August. Yeah, as you'd predict.
So this is a less scientific question, but as atheists, we're, I think, often faced with theists who would tell us that evolution is a immoral system, or anything based on non-God belief is an immoral system.
Yeah.
And I would wonder how you would counter someone who might make an assessment that, for example, if a lighter-skinned individual was born in sub-Saharan Africa, that they would be genetically, in a sense, less predisposed to positive outcomes for the offspring, obviously, and thus that there is some sort of justification in treating these people as others, and treating these people with a sort of social norm to say that they're outside the group and should be rejected, because this is often the criticism we're faced with. Obviously, we can use our big brain to have values beyond that, but this is the type of criticism. So basically the question is it not in some sense evolutionary viable to have racial prejudices in those types of situations?
Okay, so there are like 3 different issues in all of that. Do you mind if I talk a bit to kind of address them all? Or, okay. Okay. So one is most people seem to not understand what evolution is and what it is not. And I think a lot of this, if you go back to, say, the Scopes trial in 1924, and that's a beautiful example because none of those people are still around, to be offended. So you're not offending any particular individual in this conversation. But so William Jennings Bryan, who was speaking on behalf of trying to keep evolution out of the public school system because it was bad. It was teaching people this survival of the fittest idea, and that we should apply that to how we interact with each other. He never read Darwin's work. What he read were Nazi propaganda books. And they did argue for survival of the fittest. But Darwin never coined that phrase. That was actually by another guy who was an economist at the time. And he came up with survival of the fittest. You get economists, not biologists. And so evolution is not a philosophy of how humans interact with each other. It is a value-free system of how mutations happen environments are different, and some environments will favor certain mutations over others. And over time, you get differences between populations. There's no morals in there, there's no values in any of that. And that does make some people uncomfortable, but it definitely isn't advocating that humans should treat each other bad, you know, by any means. You know, we're social animals. We do really well by treating each other well. So another part to that is, you know, I do a lot of work in East Africa, so I spend a lot of time there. And one of the things that was really fascinating to observe is in Tanzania, there's actually quite a few people who have albinism. And one that shows you that culture can really overcome mutations that are somewhat deleterious. I mean, God, our culture can do all kinds of amazing things. And that these people wear hats. I mean, you know, and they live to adulthood, and they get married, and they have children, and they're in society. But that said, on the coast, there are problems today where people who like to practice, what would be the right, I forget what the term is for it, sort of a sense of like a type of like voodoo witchcraft kind of thing. They kidnap these people because they think their body parts have magical powers. This is today. So who's the bad? And, you know, if you want to have some value-laden implications to that, which one's worse? Anyway, so that one. And then, okay, then the other one, I'm trying to remember everything you asked. So I also was thinking about these ideas about there being, it kind of touched, your question touched on, I think, races, and whether or not there are inherent differences between different groups of people. And the study of skin color variation, and actually the whole study of sort of modern human variation, especially in this country, has a very, very ugly history. So if you think about the foundation of this country, you had a bunch of European colonialists who came in, and there were people here when they showed up. And who were those people? Well, the other thing is, like, by the time a lot of colonialists got here, a lot of the native people, they had been wiped out by disease. So you actually had evidence, archaeological evidence, of a pretty complex society of people who lived here, but not very many of them are around anymore. And their cultures had been so disrupted by the massive epidemics that had hit. I mean, the estimates are like 90% of the Native American populations were wiped out. It's crazy. So if you think about the decimation to a culture or cultural groups caused by that, that there were a lot of controversies about, sorry, sort of a long-winded answer. Okay, but it's just like, I think it's a neat story. So there's this whole, within the founding of our country, with the founding of the Smithsonian Institution, one of the really big scientific questions that needed to be addressed was, who built these mounds? How many of you all been in the Mississippi River Valley on the East Coast, and there's these big earthen mounds, and some of them are shaped like serpents and animals, and who built them? Cahokia, exactly. Cahokia is just amazing. Anyway, just an amazing cycle. So there were these big, complex societies that built these mounds. But the Native Americans who were living here by the time the colonialists, sort of by the time you get to the 1700s, they were like, we don't know who built them, you know, so, because they had been decimated, remember? And so then who built them? Was it a lost tribe of Israel? Was it the Native Americans? These are, you know, real questions, because if it was a lost tribe of Israel, then the Europeans who showed up had every right to take that land back, because the Native Americans who were living here then had come in and decimated that tribe. And so they were just rightfully claiming land that was theirs. You see where I'm going? So this is why it mattered, because then if you could figure out who built the mounds, you can figure out who has the moral high ground here and how you're going to interact with each other. And then you've got Joseph Smith and the Mormons. And basically Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the first book that he wrote was basically a story of who built the mound builders. But then that book got lost, and that's kind of a cool story. And so then he wrote another book, and that became the Book of Mormon. So all of this stuff is intertwined. But so, in order to figure out who built the mounds, the Smithsonian Institution, their very first publication was where they had sent out an expedition to try to answer this question. So these questions of how do people differ from each other, how do these groups all interrelate to each other, are instrumental to the founding of this country. And I hate to say it, but that one of the earliest scientific theories that scientists in our country, in the United States of America, came up with that brought them some respect from European scientists was this idea of polygeny. And polygeny is the idea that God created different races of people and that they have evolved at somewhat different rates. And yeah, these are the scientists in our country, and this was the first scientific theory that kind of got us some cred in Europe. And it's just obviously today wrong, but when you think about what the people were struggling with at the time, those social issues were having huge effect on the science that they were doing. And of course there were some biases, be they blatant or subconscious or whatever, but it really shaped the foundation of science in this country, was rooted in that. And so the Europeans were arguing that there was just one creation, because a lot of religious people thought that, well, if there were multiple creations, God doesn't do multiple creations, he did one creation, you know. And so there were these biblical arguments for all of that too. But so I don't know if in that are some answers to the questions that you raised, or ish.
We've got a question back here. First, I wanted to say thanks for coming to speak to the ACSJ tonight.
Oh, thanks.
And you touched on how people who live near the equator tend to be darker skinned than those who don't.
Yeah.
And so I may be reading into this a little bit too much, but I sense that what you're getting at there is that explains why those who are living at the equator are darker than those who don't live at the equator. So if you took, say, two Caucasian couples, and then you took one of them, say, when they were really young, and placed them at the equator, and they spent a lot of time out in the sun, got really dark before they procreated, and the other Caucasian couple, who's from the same place and has the same ancestry as the first one, stays up in the north somewhere, and then they each have children.
Yeah.
Would the ones at the equator who've gotten a lot more sunlight,
Would they have darker skin?
would they have darker skinned children?
It's a fabulous question. I'm glad you raised it, because it brings up the other ways that pigmentation changes. And so there's about 26 genes that are involved in influencing pigmentation in humans. And so there's multiple ways that multiple elements that tie into this. One would be how much melanin, how dense the melanin, and then there's another element of that as well, but not the number of melanocytes. So that sort of sets your baseline skin color, okay? And that's like the skin color that, like right here, you know, where you don't really get much sun unless you go outside like this. Anyway, so in your nether regions where you don't really see the light of day, genes determine this. So a lot of people who are lighter skinned, and people with darker skin too, will also get tan. But tanning is something very different. There is a genetic component to it. That do you have the proteins that respond well to tanning, and some people tan very well even if they have very fair skin, and some people don't tan at all. You know, I don't tan whatsoever. I also don't really burn, but that's because those are two separate things, okay? So tanning is really just a short-term response of the melanin just getting excited because of that ultraviolet radiation, and that if you don't stay out in the sun, then the tan will go away, as you know. That's not genetic. So having the ability to respond like that is genetic, but the response itself is not. So your kids can't inherit that. Actually, getting sunburned is something separate too. So there's erythemia, which is the getting sunburned. There's tanning, which is something separate. And then there's this just what color skin, how much melanin you have to begin with. And so the what color skin you have, that's determined by mutations in different genes. And your ability to tan is determined by mutations in different genes. But so that wouldn't happen. So you couldn't pass on in that short of amount of time a change in skin color to your offspring. But what could happen is, let's say that you had a population of very fair-skinned people, say from Scandinavia, and you moved them to the highlands of Ethiopia, heck, let's send them to Kenya. Let's have them in Kenya in the Lake Turkana Basin because it's really hot there and it's really sunshiny and it doesn't rain. So they're living there. It's going to take thousands of years to accumulate random mutations in those 26 genes that influence the level of melanin in their skin to then have variation upon which selection could operate. So probably more like tens of thousands of years and maybe even like hundreds of thousands of years because you have to get the genetic mutations in order to have selection be able to operate on it. So it's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up.
So I need to ask you, a lot of this lathering up of suntan lotion and everything, I mean, we're basically doing that now because everybody's terrified of getting skin cancer.
Yeah.
So have there been any studies done as far as the lighter the skin, the more likely you are to get skin cancer, or how is that?
Yes, yeah, definitely there is a correlation, a very high correlation. But the interesting thing being that skin is really complicated, and that there's multiple ways to have more melanin in your skin. There's also multiple ways to have skin that's more and less sensitive to ultraviolet radiation. And there was a study that came out very recently, like within the last couple of months. And remember how I mentioned those keranocytes? I can never say it properly. But basically the keratin in your epidermis, there are genes that influence the thickness of that, and that seems to actually have an effect to susceptibility to different kinds of skin cancers as well. And that's got nothing to do with melanin. And so melanin levels have a big effect, but it's not the only thing. Because there are some fair-skinned people who don't get skin cancer. And so it's multifactorial, as it always ends up being more and more complicated. And so there's never a good answer. But
simple questions. How do mixed-race children become beige? And yeah, I'll just go with that.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, it's beautiful. It's like the family, the gypsy family in Italy. You guys hear about this? It must have been about 6 months ago. And there was a fair-skinned, blonde-haired little girl that was found hanging out with this family, and authorities took her away from them because they said that could possibly be your child. Turns out she was their child. So remember, there's 26 genes involved in influencing human levels of melanin, and that some of them have more dominant effects than others, and this hasn't been very well worked out, but that basically then you have signal for different levels of melanin, and not all of them are expressed. Some of them are expressed in a somewhat additive way, that if you have, let's say, 25 different versions of these 26 genes, that you're going to have pretty dark skin, but you have one that has a code that would be for light skin. And then let's say, you make a baby with somebody who just happens to have a similar combination. So their skin color is very similar to yours, but they carry versions of genes that can code for light skin. You can end up with kids with light skin. And similarly, the opposite way around. So with 26 different genes and all the different variants that you have of those, you can get some pretty complicated inheritance patterns. But when people who, for most of human evolution, we tended to have sex with people that we knew, right? And we didn't move around. I know cyber sex is kind of a new thing, but we tended not to move very far because airplanes are a pretty new thing too. And so, you tended to actually have a lot genetically in common with the people kind of around you. So the amount of variation wasn't all that great as far as one could walk on foot, in a sense. And it wasn't until we started traveling much greater distances that people even started commenting on skin color differences. So not sure if that entirely answers your question, but.
So I believe you showed a slide where the number of women dying in childbirth was greater in the equatorial regions, which I believe you attributed to less vitamin D deficiency and less calcium absorption, weaker bones, and
I apologize if that's how, I actually did not mean that whatsoever. I meant it more in the sense of that map from the World Health Organization was actually talking more about less developed countries and access to health care, and that's why you end up in these sub-Saharan African countries having really high maternal death rates. But you also see that in some other countries, and you also see it in not that high, but you also see higher maternal death rates in states that have less good health care. for example, too. So I just wanted to clear that up. So I wasn't
it's not due to more hip bone deformations in those countries?
No, what I was trying to make the point with that was that being able to successfully give birth, there's a very strong selection for that, and that even today, if you take away healthcare, good healthcare, there's still very intense selection on that process to happen well.
Okay, I got
there's
the
not a lot
impression
of yeah. Sorry about that.
Evolution overdid it, and the darker they got too dark skin.
Oh, I'm so sorry if that's what. Okay. Yeah, that was. I'm really glad you brought that up because. No, no. Mostly, I just wanted to show that there is still intense selection for that pelvic cavity and for the birth canal, because it's a very tight fit with these big brained babies that we have, and there's not a lot of room for error. And so when you do have things such as calcium deficiencies, that the bones are softer, any deformation in that pelvic inlet or outlet, and you're going to have problems in childbirth. And so those are very real selective factors that still happen today, especially in areas where there's not good health care. But it was more about just that it is strong selection, because a lot of people kind of say, oh, there's no such thing as selection on people anymore, and yeah, there is, because most people don't have Kaiser down the street.
I have a question about evolution and clothing. Doesn't clothing obviate or cancel out all our skin color differences?
It sure does have a serious effect, doesn't it? Yeah. There's well, and this is why when you think about the people living in Tanzania that have the albinism, they can do fine because they do keep themselves covered, even though they are at pretty high risk for bad sunburns. Yes, clothing, culture is pretty impressive. There's actually a really interesting study that was done by Mark Stoneking and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute. They have the Max Planck Institutes. Do you know about these in Germany? There's a whole bunch of them. They have an institute for evolutionary anthropology. Could you imagine that in this country? The government giving money for evolutionary anthropology? So Mark Stoneking and his group actually looked at head lice versus body lice. And when they diverged as a way to try to get at the timing of when we started wearing clothes, because body lice can't survive on your head and vice versa. And I probably shouldn't have brought it up because I can't remember what the date was. You'll have to invite me back.
Okay, all right, well, we'll cut it there because it is getting late, so I want to make sure you guys can head out if you want to. But Leslea will be hanging around if you guys want to ask her a few more questions. So let's give her another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.